My name is Sander and I'm a big fan of coffee, cocoa and the climate. And since you're watching, I'm going to bet that you are too. When you're like us, you love thinking and talking about how we can produce all the products we love so much while remaining within our planetary boundaries. For this episode of the Carblecast, I wanted to reflect a little bit on the Chocoa trade conference, which we had here in Amsterdam at the beginning of February, and share 3 observations with you from the conversations I had with companies in the cocoa and chocolate space. My first observation is about the EUDR, the European Deforestation Regulation. In case you haven't been following, the EUDR requires all companies importing a range of commodities, including coffee and cocoa, into the European Union to provide evidence that their products were developed on land that was not deforested after December 31st, 2020. And for this purpose, the European Forest Observatory have released a base map that should show all the areas that were forest at the cutoff date, so at December 31st, 2020. Now, there are a number of problems with this base map. The main one being that it overstates forests. So coffee or cocoa plantations, as well as other commodities, are often interpreted as forests. So if an importer would rely only on the Forest Observatory base map, it would actually show that all their farm polygons fall in lands that were classified as forests at the cutoff date. Clearly that's not working. At the Chocoa fair, there were plenty of companies offering services for EUDR compliance. If I exaggerate a little bit, then I would say that every second booth belonged to a company that was working on EUDR. And I saw companies that offer traceability services linked to EUDR, so they collect farm data, farm polygons, and then maybe connect with a third-party service provider to check if these farms were EUDR compliant or not. And I also saw a lot of companies that do remote sensing, so that do these measurements themselves. And typically these companies would have their own 2020 base map available. So a map that they claim is more accurate than the Forest Observatory base map. All of that makes a lot of sense, but then the chocolate and cocoa companies that I was speaking to, they all said they didn't want to use any of these proprietary base maps for 2 reasons. The first reason was that it's impossible to check the quality of these maps. It's very easy, of course, for somebody to develop a map that understates the amount of forest in supply chains. So it needs to be peer-reviewed in order for it to have any value. And secondly, it's still unclear how the competent authorities, which is the term that the EUDR uses to describe whichever government body will check all these imports, how these authorities will do their own analysis. If they're comparing my farm polygons with another base map, clearly they're going to have a different outcome. So all of that is still very much unclear. One approach that we're testing out here at Carble is to use a combination of these open source and peer-reviewed maps. In this case, we would start with the Forest Observatory base map, then add a crop identification layer, which shows all the areas that were established cocoa or coffee plantation at the year 2020. We remove these areas as being not forests. And then finally, we also look at deforestation events after 2020, since we've seen that a lot of companies, when they collect their farm polygons, include some remaining forests that the farmers decided to protect within their farm boundaries. And obviously, these also fall under the EUDR compliance. So farmers cannot cut down any of these forests either. However, clearly something will need to move in the coming 10 months until the EUDR comes into effect. For example, auditors clarifying how they're going to audit all this data. And maybe there will be open source platforms like Global Forest Watch Pro, which also use the same data sets as the auditors will use, which will make it much easier for everybody to comply, of course. My second observation is about offsetting. Previously, if I would talk to companies about their climate goals, there would at least be a mention of offsetting. So either selling carbon credits within their supply chain to finance the transition to regenerative farming, or purchasing carbon credits from outside of their value chain to neutralize their own emissions. This year, not a single one of all the companies I spoke to mentioned offsetting. And I think this is for a number of reasons. The first being that, especially in the cocoa and chocolate space, all major companies have committed to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And the Science-Based Targets Initiative is clear. It requires companies to reduce 90 to 95% of their own emissions, including their value chain emissions, before using carbon removals in the form of carbon credits to neutralize the last 5 to 10% of their hard-to-abate emissions. Additionally, with the new greenhouse gas protocol coming out later this year, it is clear that selling carbon credits from your own value chain is no longer an option, because any reductions or removals associated with the sale of carbon credits from your supply chain need to be reduced from your own GHG target accounting, making it completely infeasible for companies to sell carbon credits from their supply chain. And finally, of course, we also have the European Green Claims Directive coming up soon. The European Green Claims Directive makes it illegal for companies to claim carbon neutrality or a positive climate impact based solely on carbon offsets. So companies need to reduce or remove emissions prior to compensating for them. Another factor here may be that traders face massive and still increasing pressure from their buyers, so from roasters or manufacturers, to work on their emissions. A factor here is that it is a best practice under the Science-Based Targets Initiative to link executive pay to near-term decarbonization goals. And this of course means that there's massive buy-in at the C-level of companies to work on their targets. Now, the most common approach to work on carbon goals in the coffee and cocoa space is still to plant trees in or adjacent to the farms in the supply chains. This is actually becoming a growing part of the business model of traders. Since exporters are the closest to the farmers and they often already have a well-trained field staff, they're very well positioned to implement these sustainability programs. It's interesting that most of the budget from these programs still comes from the manufacturers and the brands. Since traders typically operate on very thin operating margins, their entire business model is about scale. They don't really have the budget to work on these projects, but the manufacturers and the brands do. All of these projects, of course, need monitoring and reporting, which is a key part of what we're working on here at Carble. Now, the third and, in my opinion, the most interesting thing I observed is about the switch from removals to reductions. And it becomes a little bit technical, but bear with me and I'll try to keep it very simple. First, let's understand the difference. So a reduction is when we reduce the emissions within a supply chain. We prevent carbon from entering the atmosphere. A removal is when we sequester carbon from the atmosphere. So we plant trees that grow, and over, say, 20-year period, they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turn it into biomass, into more tree, basically. Now, the second thing we need to understand is the difference between land use change emissions and land management emissions. Land use change emissions are emissions from carbon that is being released due to a change in the use of the land. So due to a change from a forest to a plantation. Any change in the tree cover of a plantation after the land use change event is considered land management, and it has to be reported separately. So again, keep in mind, deforestation isn't the same as tree cover loss. Deforestation really has to do with a change in the primary use of the land from forest into agricultural land, where tree cover loss happens at plantations afterwards. And it's actually a massive component of the footprint of coffee and cocoa, much bigger than most companies are aware of. Well, clearly, once a cocoa farm is in our supply chain, it's too late to prevent deforestation, but we can still prevent tree cover loss. And why this is all relevant is, like I said before, previously the focus of companies was on planting new trees in their own supply chains. And trees take 20 years to grow and absorb all the carbon back from the atmosphere. But if trees are cut down and used as firewood, all that carbon enters the atmosphere today immediately. So clearly, preventing tree cover loss should have our highest priority as an industry. And I was super happy to see that the larger cocoa and chocolate companies are actually seeing this, and they are now starting to make plans for reducing tree cover loss in their supply chains. That made me super optimistic about the future of the cocoa industry, and I hope we'll see more in similar industries, of course, the coffee industry included. Anyway, these were my takeaways from Chocoa. I would love to hear what your takeaways are. Please comment below. You can find us at carble.co or at LinkedIn. This was the Carblecast.